Good evening, everybody. If you will, get your Bibles and open up to 2 Samuel chapter 11. 2 Samuel chapter 11. Now, where we left off last time was David, a man after God's own heart, looking from his palace down on the city of Jerusalem, and he sees a beautiful woman bathing. And he inquires about her, and he finds out that she is the wife of one of his mighty men, Uriah the Hittite. And we talked about last time, at that moment, for certain, if not before, certainly at that moment, he should dismiss any thoughts, any attraction that he has to this woman. And you would expect a man after God's own heart to do that. And David would probably expect himself to do that. You know, I can't imagine that David would ever look back on this and say, well, I just didn't know any better. I can't, you know, he would be just like we are sometimes. It's like, that's not me. Why did I do that? I know better than that. So today we have the unfortunate task of looking at a very ill-fated decision that David makes. It says that he sent for her and took her, and she came to him, and he lay with her, for she was cleansed from her impurity, and she returned to her house. There's a lot of information in this verse. First of all, the fact that he would send for her. I don't care what intentions he may have had at that point. Does he have any business sending for her? No, none. Nothing good was going to come of that. And I don't know, he said, well, I didn't intend for it to go that far. Well, nothing good was going to come of that. And so that was a bad decision. It led to adultery, and then this is thrown in here, and I'm not sure what to make of it, and so y'all may have other thoughts on this. But when it says, he lay with her, for she was cleansed from her impurity. Does that seem like the biggest problem here? That doesn't seem like it's the biggest problem. And I wonder if that's not in there because this almost becomes a rationale to David in some way. You know, I'm thinking about in Proverbs chapter 7 where it talks about the immoral woman. The immoral woman comes to the youth devoid of understanding, and she says, I have searched for you and I found you, for I have sacrificed my peace offerings and I have paid my vows. Like what? That makes it okay to commit fornication? Because you did some of the things that the law said? And I don't know if this is a similar type statement, that in some way this was some justification in David's mind that, well, it would be okay because she's cleansed from her impurity. I don't know why that's in there. You may have other thoughts that would shed a different light on that, because I've been curious as to why that's in there. But then I was thinking of Proverbs chapter 7, where that same line of thought seems to be there that, well, I've done this for the Lord, or this, and so maybe this would justify it. Because I know sometimes our minds think that way. Sometimes we justify one sin because, well, at least I'm not doing this. And so I don't know. Do y'all have any thoughts on that? Well, we'll leave it right there then.
That right there is also, it refers to Genesis 34, chapter 34, verse 2. It's talking about, and when Shechem, the son of Hamor, the Hittite prince of the country, saw her and took her and laid with her and violated her, his soul was strongly attracted to Dinah, the daughter of Jacob, and he loved the young woman and spoke kindly of the young woman. So there's other times, even though it's wrong, there's other times that princes actually did similar things that King David did, but it's not that it's right, but right. It just shows, that.
That's right. Yeah, which is, you bringing that up is actually interesting because Shechem was, a Canaanite, and the sons of Jacob realized, man, this is awful that this would happen. He's treated her like a prostitute. And you would think David would never be like Shechem, but David is like Shechem at this point. That's a good point.
Yeah, I was just thinking about David's in this position, not this exact position, but king over Israel because of God. God has blessed him throughout his life and exalted him. And now David is somewhat using God's blessings to accomplish this.
Yeah.
Because, who else could send for a woman and have her
Right.
come to his door?
That's right.
He's in an exalted position where he can do that, and he's using that privilege in a corrupted way.
That's exactly right. And many times God's blessings affects us that way because we start to think we have the right to more and more and more, and that's not true. One other thing that I want to point out from verse 4 before we move on, she returned to her house. In Proverbs, it talks about, one of the things that talks about is how an adulteress can, the way that it works is she eats and then wipes her mouth and says, I have done no evil. That's the way the proverb words it. What it is saying is that the deed is committed, and then it is as if nothing happened. Nothing happened. David sending her back to the house is just like, well, that's over with. Nothing bad happened there. But that's not the case, is it? That's not the case. Something did happen there. And David would have liked to have forgotten about it. Maybe Bathsheba would like to forget about it, and it never be brought up again. But it is going to be brought up again. And even if there wasn't a conception that took place because of this adultery, would it all be okay? No, it would not be. But David gets a reminder here. He can't put it out of his mind because the woman conceived, and she sent and told David and said, I'm with child. And now David is going to have to face this and do something about it. So he's got a second decision to make here. All right, so he made a first decision, and it was a bad decision. It was a sinful decision. Now there's a second decision that has to be made. What do you do when you make a mistake? What we typically...
And it just gets worse.
And it just gets worse. That rather than correcting it at this point or doing what he can to correct it at this point, he doesn't. He goes in deeper. And one sin leads to a second sin.
It's basically like when you tell a lie and you tell another lie and
Yeah.
that lie and it's thing. Which would be the best thing you done when you told the first one. When somebody asked you the second, you should have fessed up and told the truth.
Yeah, but
You only had one lie to deal with, but it just grows. Just
But-
like the sin grows with David.
that's right. And the reason that happens is because now not only do I have so I told the first lie assuming to get out of trouble. Now the second lie, I'm not only telling it to stay out of trouble, but I'm also, because now I've got my own personal shame involved in this if I were to fess up and say that I lied the first time. So there's double pressure now to lie a second time, or a third time, and a fourth time, and it continues. And so we see that cycle, and Satan just has to be laughing as he watches us in this downward spiral when we get caught up in this. I heard a sermon. I borrowed the sermon and preached a series on it, but it was from this, and it was talking about sin takes you further than you meant to go. It keeps you longer than you meant to stay, and it costs you more than you intended to pay. And that is so true. That is so true. And we see that in David's life here. Yes, Tina.
I was saying that I always think when my business was, if you don't start moving, they won't be moving.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Absolutely. Absolutely. And those first initial, that's why when David looks down off of his rooftop, that was the moment to, what Barney Fife say, nip it in the bud. That was the time to do it. Cut that off right there. Don't continue. But once you start going down that path, it gets harder and harder and harder.
Do you think that in verse 4, for she was purified from her uncleanness, has to do with a little bit of this 12, the purification time for women? Could that also be maybe why that verse is in there?
Well, I think that is what it's talking about. What I'm wondering about, though, is like, okay, so because in a normal marital relationship, this would be a time where sexual relations could take place. Is that somehow justification for adultery? to take place? No, but is it in David's mind? Why is it mentioned here as he took her and lay with her for she was cleansed from her impurity? That's the question that I have. But you're right. That's where it comes from. Is I believe that it's a reference back to Leviticus and the law about that.
Maybe it's just giving us some insight as far as his reasoning has become twisted at this point in time.
Yeah. Which all of us who have given into temptation could look back and say, yeah, my reasoning was twisted at that time.
I've talked to a lot of different people from, different backgrounds as far as faith about this story. And a universal thing that most people I've talked to outside of this group is people have a tendency to want to distance themselves from this story. In other words, they have a hard time relating to whether it be adultery or especially murder. And so, they cast a longing eye on David and think, man, I can't believe he done this, instead of making the connection and realize, hey, we all mess up.
Yes.
We all fall short at, periods of our lives and try to draw that connection and learn from this lesson. But my experience, people tend to want to try to distance themselves more from this story than draw closer to it and realize how corrupt humanity is and how exalted God is and how we need him and draw off of him to have any hope and chance in life.
I think this story is, yes, it's painful because David's a hero of mine, and to watch him fall like this is heartbreaking. But this story provides so many lessons for me. First of all, I know that I can do the same thing. If David could, I know that I could do the same thing. So I should never look and say, well, I would never. Yeah, I could. Secondly, when I do mess up, and Don, I've heard you mention this a number of times, David falling so royally and receiving forgiveness from God becomes this great source of encouragement that, well, if God could forgive David of what he did, then the Lord could forgive me of what I did as well. And so it works both ways. It's a great cautionary tale, and it's also an account of great mercy and forgiveness of God, and what we have to do to receive that. And we'll talk about that as we get further into it. Any other thoughts before we?
Last week, that David was a type of Jesus. Jesus was set on the mountain and tempted one. David, he's on the rooftop and he's tempted.
That is right.
That's good.
And he should have said, the scripture says, thou shalt not do.
Absolutely. In case y'all missed that, because Timmy doesn't talk real loud when he's talking. In case that was worth repeating, though. David was a type of Jesus, and Jesus was on the mountain and was tempted. David was on the housetop and was tempted. What David should have done is said, it is written, thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's wife, and overcome that. I want to piggyback off of that thought right there, because we're saying, oh, maybe David he's the perfect king. Is he the perfect king? No. And so I mentioned this before, but heard somebody say one time that what we see in the line of the kings during the united and the divided kingdom is we see let's say a crown. They said a mantle, but let's say a crown. And it's placed upon each king, and it just doesn't fit right. It doesn't fit right. And some it fits a little closer. David, it almost fits, but it doesn't quite fit. Some it just doesn't fit at all. But when it's set on Jesus' head, it fits perfectly. In other words, that's the king that we're waiting for and longing for. We get glimpses of what could be good about a king and what could be bad about a king, but we can't find that perfect king until we get to Christ. Okay, so what David does at this point, well, we've got a problem. How are we going to cover this up? Well, I know. I'll call Uriah in from the battle. He'll come home. He'll be with his wife. The timing, maybe nobody will calculate that up real carefully, and everybody will just assume, well, Uriah went home, and so she must have conceived while Uriah was home. So he calls from Uriah from the battle line, and Uriah comes, and he says, so how's the war going? Yeah. How's Joab? Okay, all right, yeah. All right. Well, I want you to go home, and I just want you to enjoy some time here and relax and have a good time before you go back. And so he says, go down to your house. He was very specific. Go down to your house and wash your feet. That's the idea of relax. So Uriah departed from the king's house, and a gift of food followed the king. Followed from the king. In other words, go home and just, here's something for you and your wife to enjoy. But what does Uriah do? Yeah, that's right. With all the servants of his Lord, he did not go down to his house. What are we seeing here in Uriah?
To the war effort that he wasn't going to take a liberty, even though it was called by the king and asked about the war.
His faithfulness and his loyalty. Now think about this. What we have been doing is, as we've looked at David, is we've looked at David's faithfulness and loyalty. All the way through his fleeing from Saul, when he becomes king, he's faithful and loyal. As a matter of fact, in the last few chapters, we just talked about his faithful and loyalness to the covenant that he made with Jonathan and taking care of Mephibosheth, his faithfulness and loyalty even to the foreign king of Ammon. And now what do we see in David? His unfaithfulness. His unfaithfulness to his very own people. And to those who would be most loyal to him. And so it's just heartbreaking what we're seeing at this point. But the other
thing that you see through all of David's issues with Saul, even up through all of his men, no matter who they were, even Joab, they were all loyal to David. They would do anything. They would give their life for him because they were so loyal that they knew that he was anointed by God.
That's right. Well, David finds out that Uriah did not go down to his house. So he calls for Uriah and he says, what's up? Why didn't you go home? And Uriah's answer was, and I want you to notice verse 11. We'll make a deviated point here. But Uriah said to David, the ark and Israel and Judah are dwelling in tents, and my lord Joab and his servants and the servants of my lord are encamped in the open fields. Shall I then go to my house and eat and drink and lie with my wife? As you live and as your soul lives, I will not do this thing. So again, we see his determination here. His heart and thoughts are with where he thinks he should be. I should be there fighting, not enjoying some liberty with my wife. And what's interesting is, how did we start off this story? In the spring of the year when kings go out to fight, he's not out there with the ark and with Joab. He's enjoying liberties with somebody else's wife, is what ends up happening. Now, a side point here, verse 11, Uriah said to David, the ark and Israel and what? Okay, only reason I point that out is I want you to notice that already there's language showing that there's some distance between these two groups. This is a united kingdom. They're all united under David, and they'll still have another king that they'll all be united under. But already the language is suggesting that there's some separation between these two already.
It was a 3-day journey from Uriah, 2 to 3 days. So think about that. I walked 2-3 days here, and you just asked me how the war's going.
Yeah.
You had me question, why did you bring me?
Exactly. What is up with this?
And after 2 or 3 days walk home, you didn't go see your wife?
Yeah.
So it's interesting.
It is. And so David, again, he says, all right, now wait here today also and tomorrow. So where is Uriah already stated he wants to be? I need to be there at the front line. That's what my duty is. Okay. But stay another day. Stay another day, and then I'll let you depart. David needs more time here. He needs to figure out a way to make this happen. And so what he does then is he has a banquet, or he invites Uriah to come and eat. And what does he do in this? He gets him drunk. And I was thinking about, how does this work? I suppose if the king says, here, Have another one. Drink that. Drink that. Here, have another one. Have another one. I suppose if the king is putting that type of pressure on you, you do so. And so Uriah apparently does become drunk, but not drunk enough that he's going to not sleep with the servants of the king rather than go home. And so again, this does not work. He does not go down to his house. And so David, I'm sure, is keeping an eye on it this time to see. And when he does not, David's like, all right. Now, have you ever done something that is wrong because out of frustration for someone else's stubbornness? In other words, and feel justified in doing it? Well, now I guess you deserve this if you're going to be that way. And I'm just trying to think through how David could stoop to these levels. When David called from Uriah from the front lines, I don't think he ever contemplated murder. I can't imagine that being in David's mind at that point. I'm only thinking at this point in desperation is David starting to think, well, we've got to do something about this. And if he's not going to go home to his wife, then we're going to have to do something else.
But this also shows, even though that David did all this, this also shows the cunningness of the devil or the evil one about changing the situation to lead him astray, the same way that Satan done Eve and then Adam eat what they've been told not to eat. And he's been doing this all through the course of time, and he's using this opportunity to try to make David totally fall out of grace, but he didn't take into account of David actually being sorrowful later on and then asking God to forgive him. Where, like Cain and Abel, Cain didn't ask for no forgiveness.
I think about the escalation of this. First the deed was done, the sin was done. And then to try to cover his tracks, he's willing to forfeit not only his responsibility, but his right to his own, what will be his flesh and blood. It's his child, not Uriah's.
No.
But in order to cover his tracks, he's willing to forego all that. That right there, we don't talk about that aspect of it very often, but that's a pretty big one.
Yeah.
And when that doesn't work, desperate times call for desperate measures.
Yep. So in the morning, he lets Uriah go. But Uriah, I've got a message for you to give to Joab. In that message was Uriah's orders Joab's orders for Uriah's death. Set Uriah in the forefront of the hottest or the fiercest battle and retreat from him that he may be struck down and die. What a way to have someone killed. Put him in the hottest battle and then retreat from him so that he may die. First of all, how would you carry that out where only Uriah was the one affected by that? Not possible. And it doesn't end up being possible. And so can you imagine Joab when he receives this message? What? Uriah is one of our mighty men. He's been with us. So what is going on? Well, there must be something that I don't understand about this. And so when Uriah returns to Joab is fighting against the city and they're besieging it. And he assigned Uriah to the place where he knew there was valiant men. And the men of the city came out and fought with Joab, and they began to push them back. I'm getting that from the message that comes to David in a little bit. And as they pushed them back, Joab has it. So if they came out of the city and began to attack, and you push them back in, how close would you get to the city in pushing them back in?
Too close.
Well, you couldn't get too close. Why?
Archers.
That's exactly right. So you've got to keep some distance. But Joab apparently sends the order, no, you pursue them all the way to the gate. And Uriah lead the charge. And Uriah led the charge. Well, of course, when they get to the gate, the archers begin to shoot. And guess what? They're sitting ducks right underneath the wall. And Uriah's killed. Uriah is not the only one that's killed in this. And so the loss comes. So Joab sends a message back to David concerning the war, and he tells the messenger, now when you finish telling the matter of the war to the king, if it happens that the king's wrath rises, and he says, why did you approach so near to the city when you fought? Did you not know that they would shoot from the wall? Who struck Abimelech, the son of Jerubasheth? Was it not a woman who cast a piece of millstone on him from the wall so that he died in Thebez? Why did you go near the wall? So what is Joab already anticipating when this messenger gives the report of how the battle went?
It's going to go bad.
Yeah, David's like, what is wrong with you? Why would you do that? You know better than that. Well, now, if David says any of that, then you shall say, your servant Uriah is also dead. So then David would know, oh, that's how you had to get rid of Uriah. Okay, all right, I understand. So the message comes. The messenger comes to David. And the messenger said, surely the men prevailed against us and came out to us in the field, and we drove them back as far as the entrance of the gate. Then archers shot from the wall at your servants, and some of your king's servants are dead, and Uriah and your servant Uriah the Hittite is dead also.
Messenger didn't seem to have any pause in that.
If the king gets angry, well, I'm going to cut that right off.
We don't want to see the king angry.
That's right. And notice David's response. Then David said to the messenger, thus you shall say to Joab, do not let this thing displease you, for the sword devours one as well as another. Strengthen your attack against the city and overthrow it. So encouraging. Does David seem upset about this? He's just lost a number of his men. I don't know how many, but several of his men, including at least one of his mighty men. And David's like, well, that's the way war is. It happens like that. Now, Joab already suspected that he would be very upset under normal circumstances, but he's not upset about this. Loss of life, all David's thinking about is, problem relieved. I want you to notice a key word here. We may miss it in English. We wouldn't miss it, I don't think, in Hebrew. Notice verse 25, do not let this thing displease you. Does anybody have a footnote or a different wording there? Yes, do not let this thing be evil in your sight. Okay? Hold on to that thought, and let's drop down to verse 26 and 27. Then the wife of Uriah heard that Uriah, her husband, was dead, and she mourned for her husband. Boy, if you just camp out and think about that for a little bit, that's a sad verse. And when her mourning was over, David sent and brought her to his house, and she became his wife and bore him a son. Problem solved. Now everything is back to normal. But the thing that David had done displeased the Lord. Does anybody have a footnote on that word, displeased the Lord?
Was evil in the eyes.
Yes. Do you see what's happening here? David says, don't let this be a problem. And God says, oh, it's a problem. It's a problem. We want to convince ourselves many times, oh, this is not a problem. Don't think of this as evil. And God says, oh, it's evil. It's evil. David feels like he's got this swept under the rug. Things are okay. God says, it's not. It's not. We haven't dealt with this yet. We've got to deal with this. And this is the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. It's the beginning of wisdom. This is a healthy fear to say, I do not want to find out on the day of judgment that something that I said, let this not be evil in your sight. And God says, oh, it's evil in my sight. I want to know that it's evil in His sight right now, while I can do something about it. And so I look at this. David had convinced himself, or at least he seems to have, trying to convince himself that everything's okay when it was not with God. So we get a spiritual reality here that we can sweep something under the rug, but that doesn't do away with the reality of our guilt. Comments, thoughts, through chapter 11.
Satan done a good job of
Yes, he did.
like he does always.
That's right.
You know, Uriah was one of David's earliest supporters. You think about when David was in need, his time of need, who was there for him?
Yeah.
And then this unfolds. Again, you know, the nature of sin and the way it works, and, you know, to try to prevent other people from knowing what we'll do, the lengths we'll go to cover it up and alienate people and sever relationships, and most of our, you know, sin against God.
Yep.
But even though that David did all this sin and he was killed, when he died, I believe that he went to the Lord because he hadn't done nothing wrong in God's eyes.
Talking about Uriah?
Right.
Yeah.
Because he had actually was loyal to David, fought his wars, even though the king turned against him.
Yeah, Uriah's character, just what we read about, he seems to be very similar to David.
Yeah.
Very loyal. And,
Right.
you know, how can I go into my house when the ark?
Yes.
Like, he's very focused on what's important.
Yes.
and everything.
That's right.
And David takes advantage of that when he sends him back the letter. He knew he wouldn't read it.
Yeah. That's right. Good point. Yes.
This is just an example of how one person can affect so many people. I call them the men on the front line of the right. You know, just the unborn baby. I mean, it just affects so many people.
Casualties.
Exactly. That's it. That's an excellent point. And how many times have we sinned saying, well, if it hurts anybody, it won't hurt me? We don't know that. We don't know that. We can't predict that.
Typically, who does it end up hurting? It hurts those that are closest to you is who it hurts.
Yeah.
Because of disappointment and shame and everything else. Usually, I mean, that's who you hurt.
Yep.
Are the people that are you're closest to.
Yep. So I mentioned a second ago this idea of we can convince ourselves that, oh, this is all taken care of, this is not evil, and it not be that way in God's sight. Verse 1 of chapter 12, the Lord sent Nathan to David. That was an act of grace by God. When God sends someone to rebuke you, when He sends a rebuke to you, whether it's through His Word or through somebody talking to you or some other way that is brought to your attention, that's an act of grace. So that the first time that we understand that this is evil in God's sight is not on the day of judgment, but we find out beforehand while we can still do something about it. And so God sends Nathan to David. Now, how often do you think when somebody comes to rebuke you, you think, oh, this is God's grace being shown to me? Is that how we think of rebuke normally? But it is. That's exactly what it is.
And these two have a relationship already.
Yes.
You know, we've already seen 1 Samuel 7, you know,
Yes.
them back and forth. And so, you know, Nathan, and I don't know this for sure, but this easily could be interpreted as a friend
Yes,
of David.
I think so.
So, you know, David, I don't think he would foresee any type of threat
Right.
or anything of that nature,
No.
any type of confrontation.
Yes. And it appears that when Nathan comes to David, I would have loved to know whether the Lord gave Nathan this parable or he just told Nathan, you go and rebuke David, and Nathan came up with this parable to approach David. But he comes as if, I'm approaching the king because we've got a problem and justice needs to be done about this, and you're the king, and so it's kind of your responsibility to make sure this is handled correctly. And so he tells the story, and he says, there are two men in one city. There were two men in one city, one rich and the other poor. The rich man had exceedingly many flocks and herds, but the poor man had nothing except one little ewe lamb, which he had bought and nourished, and it grew up together with him and was with his children. In other words, it was a bottle baby lamb that he had raised up, and it'd become a family pet. It had almost become like one of his children. And it ate his own food and drank it from his own cup and lay in his bosom, and it was like a daughter to him. So Nathan paints this picture. Is this something that David could probably understand and relate to? Yes. He understands that relationship, how a human can bond with a sheep. And so this kind of brings him back to his childhood in many ways. And in this, a traveler came to the rich man who refused to take from his own flock and from his own herd to prepare one for the wayfaring man who had come to him. But he took the poor man's lamb and prepared it for the man who had come. And how does David respond? Oh, can you believe that? How would somebody be like that? As the Lord lives, the man who has done this shall, the New King James says, surely die. Does anybody have a different rendering or a footnote there? Is deserving of death. In other words, I don't know that you can give the death penalty for stealing a sheep according to the law. I guess the king possibly could, but he's saying, but what this guy did was more than just he stole a sheep. He did something that was awful in taking this family pet when he had so much that he owned. And so then he says, he shall restore fourfold for the lamb, which was what the law required. Because he did this thing and because what? He had no pity. He had no pity. And that's what David really recognized. If this would have been a different story, it still would have been wrong. He still would have had to restore fourfold. But if this man had nothing to eat and he was starving and he took another man's sheep to prepare because he was starving to death, but that's not even what happened here. This man had plenty, but he wanted more. And so he did this and he had no pity. And David in his fury is upset about this. Now let me tell you what a parable does. Tom Hawley said this is what an original did. What a parable does is a parable helps you to see the truth before you make the application to yourself. David sees the truth of how terrible it is for someone who has so much then to take what belongs to somebody else for their own selfish reasons. He sees that truth, and he's upset about it. And he sees this man deserves to die.
I listened to the recording, and Larson presented this last time through, and he said that Nathan drew a sword within an inch of David's conscience at this point. I thought that was pretty good. Mm-hmm. Pretty good line.
Yeah. Yeah, that's right. And then Nathan says to David, you are the man. I'm talking about you, David. Now, I do believe that Nathan was a friend of David. And I don't know how in the Nelson New King James, you are the man with an exclamation point. And that's very possible. The Hebrew doesn't have exclamation points, so we don't know. But he could have said it with great sadness too. David, you're the man I'm talking about.
You know, there'll come a point in time in history that as we progress through the kings, a prophet comes and confronts a king like this, and what would happen to the prophet? Yeah.
Yeah.
And David's in that position.
Yes, and at this point right now, would you put it past David? We've already seen him take somebody out and several out. Yeah, that's right. That's exactly right. So Nathan still had some courage here in this. Nathan continued, thus says the Lord God of Israel. And I want you to think about how these words would sting David. God said, I anointed you king over Israel. I delivered you from the hand of Saul. I gave you your master's house, your master's wives into your keeping. I gave you the house of Israel and Judah. There's that separation again. And if that had been too little, I also would have given you much more. Stop right there just for a second. David knows how much the Lord's given. We have Psalms where David talks about how God had blessed him, how richly God had blessed him. He knows this. And to hear how that's right. God has given me all this. That's exactly right. How many wives does David have at this point? I know at least 5. And if that were too little, if you needed more, I would have given you more. Let me tell you something that I really try to draw from this, is when I'm starting to desire something that I don't have in an unhealthy way, when I'm starting to covet something, what I try to remember is, if what God has already given me were too little, what would He do? He would give me more. And so if I really need that, then the Lord will provide that. I don't have to covet it and connive and figure out a way to obtain that if I really need that, but most of the time that's not the case. I don't really need that. David didn't really need Bathsheba. Verse 9, why have you despised the commandment of the Lord? How does David feel about the commandments of the Lord? Does he have any Psalms about that? Oh, yes. If Psalm 19 is David's psalm, there's the longest chapter in the Bible about how he feels about the Lord. How I love your law, O Lord. No, you despised my commandment to do evil in my sight. You have killed Uriah the Hittite with the sword and have taken his wife to be your wife. You have killed him with the sword of the people of Ammon. Now therefore the sword shall never depart from your house, because you have despised me, and have taken the wife of Uriah the Hittite to be your wife. Thus says the Lord, behold, I will raise up adversity against you from your own house, and I will take your wives from before your eyes, and give them to your neighbor, and he shall lie with your wives in the sight of this sun. For you did it secretly, but I will do this thing before all Israel, before the sun. So, there's consequences, there's a cost for this. I think probably the greatest cost, I know the greatest cost for David is the fact that he has despised the Lord and his commandment. When we read Psalm 51, which we're not going to get to tonight, but when we read Psalm 51 next time, we'll see, against you and you only have I sinned. David got that point very strongly. But there's other consequences. The sword will never depart from your house. Your family, talking about those that you're closest to, they will hurt in this.
And the other thing that actually, I think, hurt him the worst was up to this point before Nathan come. Hey, I've done got it all, and ain't no evidence. And then God says, you're the man. So the truth of what he kept trying to hide, God actually told him. You can't hide nothing from me. I see all, I know all. And what you've done is wrong.
There would be public shame involved with it. By the way, what has David so desperately been trying to cover?
Public shame.
Public shame. And God says, no, that'll be exposed. You'll have public shame. You did it secretly, but I will do this thing before all of Israel.
Now, I want to stop right there before you move on with David here, but make a comparison at this very point with the previous king,
Yes.
Saul. When Saul was confronted with sin, what route did he typically take? Did he own it?
No.
Did he ever own it? No, he always blamed it. Well, the people wanted to do this or this, you didn't arrive when you said you would arrive, or, so on and so forth. He never owned his sin. But what's David going to do?
Yeah. It is interesting. So this statement, I have sinned against the Lord. Saul does make that almost exact statement when Samuel presses him. But then you know what the next thing he says is, honor me in the sight of the people. Mm-hmm. In other words, okay, I sinned. Just please, let's get this taken care of. That's not how David, when David says, I have sinned against the Lord, that's at a whole different level than it was with Saul. We may not pick up all of that from this passage alone. When we get to Psalm 51, we will. Timmy?
It's bad. It's just punishment sounds. Do you think God will still be the merciful?
Yeah, absolutely.
Definitely, because the law says it's supposed to be put to death.
Absolutely. And David has already said, this man deserves to die. David, in his own words, recognizes, what I did is worse than what the parable was. Yes. But notice Nathan's response. Nathan said to David, the Lord also has put away your sin. You shall not die. Wow. Now, we read that, and that's just, and maybe it happened exactly the way that it's worded here as far as in time and proximity and immediately, where just as soon as David says, yep, I sinned, well, you're forgiven. But we know there was a lot more taking place there. than just that. And what Nathan is saying is, God is willing to forgive. If you confess your faults, He's faithful and just to forgive you and to cleanse you from all unrighteousness. That's the promise in the New Testament. God seems to be acting that way here. You will not die. Does that take away the consequences? No. However, because by this deed you have given great occasion to the enemies of the Lord to blaspheme, the child also who is born shall surely die. And Nathan departed to his house. And so here is that idea again. You brought shame on the Lord's name. You've given the enemies of the Lord reason to blaspheme His name. That would have cut David deeply as well. All right, we're out of time there. We'll pick back up, and I want to dive in a little bit deeper into David's repentance here and his thought process, because I believe that's a model for how we can approach God when sin is in our life.
And I think, this is one of those characteristics of David, I think, that makes him a man after his own. When he falls, and I mean, this was a big one. This is a mighty fall.
Yes,
but how did David respond?
Yep.
And I think this is what God is seeking.
I think that's right. Thank you.
Thanks for watching. If you found this video to be beneficial, please follow us on Facebook or subscribe to our YouTube channel. Feel free to share it with others that you feel like may benefit from it. If you need to contact us, please contact us via email at quinn.church@yahoo.com. Also, if you're in the area, we would love for you to come visit with us at one of our assemblies. Have a good day.